Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on our Connected Communities webinar about when local news disappears and how delocalized media hurts communities. My name is JudeAnne Heath. I am the Executive Director for HTTP, Hispanic Tech and Telecommunications Partnerships. We are a 501c3 working with grassroots organizations, industry, and policy makers to ensure the Latino voice has a seat at the table in this digital economy and digital future. So please check us out at httppolicy.org and follow us on social media at http_policy. I'm going to start off talking about the session description today, why we're here, and introduce our two amazing panelists who I'm so grateful to have with us and hear their expertise and have this really important conversation on the subject. So this conversation is in light of recent FCC hearings and recent media mergers and corporation mergers. And it's really about how the rapid decline of local news and the growing delocalization of community media are reshaping all of our communities. Local newsrooms are shrinking and corporate consolidation expanding, and journalists, especially journalists of color, face disproportionate layoffs. Communities, especially Latinos, Hispanic communities across the nation, are left vulnerable to polarization and misinformation and disinformation. So we're here with some national experts, some newsroom leaders, and all about what this means for our civic trust, for representation, and the future of all of our communities. So please join me in welcoming Daiquiri Ryan Mercado, founder and CEO at Exito and Company, as well as Feliciano Garcia, principal at Menteca Media and senior news producer. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We are going to start off with letting our panelists introduce themselves, introduce their background, and why they're here today, and why is this an important conversation for them. So Feliciano, if you want to start us off.
Well, thank you again, HTTP, JudeAnne, Heath, for and our coalition partners for convening this timely and necessary conversation. It's very important, especially at this critical time. Today, we're not just talking about newsroom decline in the abstract. We're talking about a looming consolidation that would fundamentally reshape the broadcast news landscape. Nexstar Media Group has proposed acquiring Tegna, a deal that will combine hundreds of local stations into a single corporate entity with reach far beyond what Congress ever intended. Under federal law, no single television station owner is allowed to reach more than 39% of U.S. households, but that cap exists to protect competition, localism, and independent voices. Yet this proposed merger would move one company's reach from that 39% limit toward roughly over 80% of U.S. households. Think about it. It's going to double that limitation and that reach. It's not just a simple business transaction. It's a direct challenge to the idea that local broadcast news should remain locally rooted, responsive to communities, and independent from centralized political and corporate pressure. When ownership concentrates at this scale, local newsrooms shrink. I've seen it many times. Journalists are laid off and communities are left with fewer trusted sources of information. A little bit about me. For more than 2 decades, I've worked in and around local and national newsrooms, from producing breaking news to managing teams responsible for covering communities in moments of crisis. What I've seen consistently is that when local journalism disappears, the harm is not evenly distributed. Underrepresented communities lose not just coverage, but visibility, context, and most importantly, protection. Stories about public safety, health, housing, education, and government accountability are often the first to be cut, and those gaps become real-world risks. Local news has long functioned as a safety net, especially for communities that have been historically ignored or misrepresented, and especially for Latino communities. And when that net's stripped away, people lose trusted sources, lose access to information that affects their daily lives, and ultimately lose a voice in the systems meant to serve them. We're talking about a major shift in policy today, potentially, and I think it's very critical that we're having this conversation at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Feliciano, for giving us that important context. And Daiquiri, your intro, please, and why this is important for you.
Absolutely. Hola, mi gente. It's wonderful to be here, especially surrounded by these incredible colleagues. My name is Daiquiri Ryan Mercado. I am a civil rights lawyer and a policy strategist, and I'm the founder and CEO of Exito & Co., which is an advocacy firm that helps mission-driven organizations at the intersection of policy and community engagement. Much of my career has been shaped by a central question: who gets to be seen, heard, and believed in our public discourse? That question has guided my work across civil rights advocacy, media and broadband policy, and now through my company Exito, helping organizations navigate how power, narrative, and trust intersect in our communities. I wanted to start this conversation today by naming something that I think sometimes gets lost. Media policy can sound really abstract or technical, but it's one of the most important factors shaping how our democracy actually functions. The rules that govern who owns media, how information is distributed, and what responsibilities broadcasters and platforms have to the public don't just live on paper. Those rules and laws help shape whether communities have access to reliable local news, whether journalists can do their jobs without fear or interference, and whether people feel grounded in shared truths. And that's part of why local, reliable, well-resourced journalism matters so much. Like Feliciano said, it's how our neighbors understand one another. It's how communities hold power accountable and how people make informed decisions about their lives. So one thing is clear, right? Everyday people, advocates, policymakers alike don't want to see more consolidation in media. We don't want cookie cutter news segments about something happening hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. We want to know what's happening in our local communities, what's impacting our friends, our family, our neighbors, our loved ones. We want to be informed at the local level by locals. We want the truth. And for me, that's part of why I do this work, right? I believe that people deserve the truth, and our government is supposed to protect our access to it, not take advantage of it. So when regulators abuse their authority, when they start to police content rather than safeguarding the infrastructure, competition, and access to communications, I don't think that they just overstep legally. I think that they're betraying public trust. And so that's why I think this conversation matters today. Media policy isn't super niche. It's something that's really foundational to whether our democracy functions at all, which is a really important conversation to be having right now.
Thank you guys so much for setting the stage, as it's so important. Daiquiri, we had this FCC hearing on Wednesday with all the commissioners there, Cara Gomez and Trustee, and what was talked about. Let's kind of start there too. They talked a lot about public interest standard, and congressional members had some pointed questions for the FCC. Can you kind of give us a little background there on what is public interest standard? Why is that important? And give us some important points that we heard on Wednesday that might help shape this conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think during this hearing, we saw a couple of really central themes. And kind of before I get into the public interest standard, I think there was a really central concern about whether the FCC is being used in a way that goes beyond its statutory authority. So a lot of members of Congress raised questions about how exactly Chairman Carr has been conducting agency business, and kind of, blurring that line between regulating competition, infrastructure of communications versus content. And so that's kind of the framing of how many of the members were approaching this. And so in the context of media ownership, right, there was a lot of questions about these mergers that are happening, including the Nexstar-Tegna merger that Feliciano mentioned. Commissioner Ana Gomez was really adamant and emphasized that the erosion of local journalism isn't hypothetical, it's already happening. And so, kind of going to that broadcast ownership cap that Feliciano was mentioning, that cap is written into statute, right? That's 39%. That's law. And so kind of despite what we're seeing happening at the FCC and blurring those lines of what the agency has the authority to do, the FCC doesn't have the authority to raise or eliminate that cap. Only Congress can do that. And so that's kind of where we were brought into as well in that framing of the public interest standard. So the public interest standard is something that the FCC uses when it's evaluating broadcast license applications, renewals, mergers, like what we're talking about today, and other major transactions. The commission often has to determine whether or not to to move forward with approval of a license for a new or existing station based on whether that new or existing station has served the public interest. Now, within the actual law itself, there's not much else that is given to the FCC to say what is the serving the public interest. So over the years, regulations and court decisions have really shaped about what is and isn't allowed to be considered as a part of the public interest standard. And so historically, the courts have said that, it's okay to evaluate things like competition, localism, diversity of ownership. And that's, not just kind of demographics wise, but also just competition wise, how many different owners exist in a single market. The access to the service itself, and then this more traditional version of what we think of, will this transaction harm consumers or the communities that it's, intended to serve? What hasn't been allowed very clearly is using the public interest standard to regulate or punish editorial content. So the FCC cannot use this public interest standard as a backdoor censorship tool. And so, I think something really interesting that also came out of this hearing was the call from Commissioner Gomez to explicitly have Congress codify right into law what factors can and can't be considered in a public interest standard evaluation. And that really comes from a place of trying to prevent further misuse of that standard and further undermining of public trust. I know that was a little bit of a long overview, but I hope I set up the conversation a bit.
No, for, a very long and intricate hearing, I think that was a really good primer and basis, and kind of, does sort of give people hesitation of, will there be decisions made by any of the government agencies on just, specialty preferential treatment, or, like you said, punitive punishment on whether or not they want things to go forward, whether they're not, and we've seen that already. So it was a really good primer and setting the stage. And like she said, at the hearing, sometimes the argument that we kind of heard was that the FCC argued that the media consolidation might be necessary for local outfits to compete with, big tech as news. Feliciano, between that and also what we heard from a journalist perspective, why is it important for democracy and service provided from local stations, from what we heard from the FCC, why is it important to keep this local news from a democracy standpoint? And then also, is that consolidation actually strengthen local journalism, or is it disconnect from community realities?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to acknowledge that local news is shrinking already. It's been shrinking for decades. And that's because consolidation has changed the incentives that once sustained community-based journalism. Before, the high goal when I was coming up, and so many of us, was just to inform the community, and there was value in that. We've seen newspapers disappear and local coverage disappear. Right now, large station groups pursue scale and efficiency, but those efficiencies almost always come out at the local level. When the headquarters in New York or LA comes down with cuts, it's rarely in their backyard. It's usually at, places where they deem less valuable, less viewers. But to all those folks that live across the country, they know that's the most important news they're going to ever have and that they're going to need, especially if you're talking about emergency alert systems or specific crimes or fires, which often hit rural communities the most. What you end up with are fewer reporters, fewer beats, fewer original stories. Mergers like this next Artegna, they're framed as survival strategies, but what they translate into is layoffs, centralized production, diminished accountability. So, when you talk about the reason that media is so, local media is so important to democracy, period, it's undeniably the one vetted source of accountability for when something happens. Just imagine, someone in New York City, a producer, and I've worn this hat, the story of the day that's going to lead the newscasts across the country is ICE raids. How would someone in New York begin to tell you about how ICE raids are happening or not happening or availing themselves if you're based in Austin or you're based in Minneapolis, or you're based in Miami. They just won't and they don't. But with mergers like these, you end up with editorial decisions sort of being shoved down your throat as a community. And there's no accountability. There's no one actually measuring what's happening in your community. And it's scary because that's just a staple of our democracy. We need that independent voice. And what's happening here with more and more consolidation is we're getting less and less independent local journalism, voices that understand the communities, and it's especially dangerous for communities of color where we already have challenges. I think our newsroom people that work in newsrooms, Latinos make up about 11% compared to our 20 plus percentage of the rating, 20 plus percentage of population. So you're already looking at a very minuscule amount of representation. So once and we know that employees of color, journalists of color are the first ones to usually get cut in these big mergers. So you're looking at whittling down to 10% news force to even smaller. So who's going to actually cover the communities that we live, eat, and breathe in? I think another thing I want to talk about is what watching this recent FCC oversight hearing, the argument made by those supporting this merger and large mergers like this. They argue that scale is necessary for broadcasters to compete with large technology platforms right now, the Googles and the social media platforms. But really, in practice, the consolidation of traditional media platforms, broadcast, it does the opposite. It weakens the things that make broadcast news distinct and valuable: local presence and community trust. Centralized ownership doesn't create more competitive local journalism. It strips stations of reporters, it hollows out local coverage, and replaces it with generic content. The result's not stronger competition with tech companies, but it's the erosion of broadcast journalism itself. And as local stations lose their ability to report deeply and independently, communities are left with fewer trusted sources. Unregulated social media platforms increasingly become the only local information system. Think about it. We were talking about that the other day, right? When we were preparing for this, that, your tia wants to know what's going on in IG. She doesn't have another source for a trusted source, or that reporter we all knew growing up, or someone that's, been to the community and eats in the restaurants you do. Everybody's just looking on unvetted social information for that local ecosystem. And that's just dangerous. That's not, there's no way to check or balance what's actually happening in communities.
Those are such great points, because it sounds, cyclical. There's not creating any competition. People are running to social media because they're not seeing authenticity in their local news. They're not seeing people that look like them reporting on stories that matter deeply to the communities. And then we're losing so much. And then, yes, like you said, we're running to places that still have no accountability, or even more wild and run free, and people kind of don't know who to trust and what's real. And this is just a person with their phone, and how do I know what's really happening? And then not even to get in the conversation of AI creating news stories. We could keep going on about that, but it doesn't create any competition with tech. It's pushing people toward technology. Talking about what people want from local news. I know Daiquiri, National Hispanic Media Coalition, recently did some polling to ask the public at large about these current consolidations and media ownership and local impact, and kind of what they're looking for from news sources. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, one of our colleague organizations, the National Hispanic Media Coalition, runs the Defend the Press campaign. And so they partnered with Lake Research Partners to commission this national poll. And it really makes it extremely clear how the public feels. And that's that voters are overwhelmingly rejecting these local broadcast mergers, and they want their representatives in Congress to take action to prevent it. This is a poll that was conducted via phone and text with a sample size of likely midterm election voters across all kinds of demographics. And so these are folks that, hopefully our elected officials want to listen to. But a couple of data points from that poll that I'd like to share with our group here. More than 5 out of 6 voters, 85%, say that local news coverage about their community is important to them. And 54% say it's very important to them. So I think that's very clear, right? This is not something that, we're manufacturing to say, like, save local journalism. This is what the overwhelming majority of folks want. More than 4 out of 5 voters prefer local TV stations to be owned locally rather than by large national broadcast corporations. Again, something that feels like common sense, but is, the very real reality that we're up against. And then 4 out of 5 voters oppose loosening regulations that limit large broadcast station TV mergers. So that's that broadcast ownership gap that we've been talking about. And really folks don't support loosening that or, for either Congress or the FCC to increase or eliminate that. I think what this poll, like on the whole, has been telling us is that this consolidation isn't about financial viability of local journalism, like we were talking about, right? This is more about the power grab and using the FCC as a tool to increase wealth and influence for billionaire media conglomerates. This is not about the people. This is not about deregulation or efficiency in government. This is really about increasing that wealth and that influence.
Thank you for sharing those data points. I always hope that like data and polling can influence policy, even though, we don't always see that. Talking about what kind of members of Congress and other handful of companies control local news, who is most likely to be pushed out on this? You touched on this a little, Feliciano, but if you could both kind of talk about why does it disproportionately affect journalists of color? Why is bilingual reporting so important? And why do Black and brown journalists get hit first? And what are the risks for our Spanish language communities and immigrants serving media outlets, who need and rely on that information?
I can jump in on this one to start. I think I mentioned earlier, communities of color are already disproportionately affected because they're already underrepresented in media ownership and staffing. And I'm talking about people that are making the decisions editorially. I've been a producer my whole life, not necessarily on-air person, and people tend to get confused with that. Like, why are there so many brown or whatever faces on air? Those aren't necessarily the folks deciding what's going to be covered. When you talk about decision making, we're already a minuscule portion, and we are also communities of color are also newer to the industry. Traditionally, it's a legacy industry. Many people's parents or relatives have already been in this, and they sort of get grandfathered in, so they have more of a security system there. You're not going to let go of someone who's has an established relative. We hardly ever have that in this business, and so for those reasons, we're let go first, and then secondly, it's amazing because of Hispanic buying power in this country and the size of our population, but our audiences are still overlooked, English and Spanish language, in terms of our value as audience, even though in many of these markets, particularly in some of these urban centers, Latinos represent over half of the population. And you can talk about like cities in Texas and California, and even in the Midwest, we're a healthy 1/3. Denver, where I grew up, huge population, but people don't understand, or companies don't understand the market value, or they're not fighting for that. So instead, they focus on what has always been, which is non people of color news, stories that are very cookie cutter. You can look at the calendar and exactly what's going to happen. Exactly what's going to be covered, even though there may be a smaller festival in that, right, versus the big, Dia de los Muertos festival that's been growing every year. they'll still send people to the festival that's been covered for 40 years, 50 years. So it's, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but and it's been pretty famously reported in recent layoffs. Like a lot of people of color are disproportionately affected in these mergers and these big waves of layoffs. I mean, consolidation driven layoffs often remove journalists who provide cultural context, language access, and community trust. And when those voices disappear, you lose the nuanced perspectives that local audiences really, really rely on.
And there's something too about, authenticity. I know Ivan, everyone was excited about Fernando Mendoza playing in the championship because that was somebody they could connect to when they see names that look like ours or people that grew up like us, that, it's good for business and it's good for our buying power. Like you said, it helps when you have, a diverse set of journalists and people can bring those experience and really connect with those communities. It's good for business and it's good for people to have that. And it goes hand in hand. So just to take that away seems antithetical to what anyone would be trying to do here. So thank you for talking about that. I know, some partner organizations too, in the importance too of Spanish language media when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, civic trust, voters, getting things out. Daiquiri, do you have anything to add to that too, based on partner organizations and your work on how important that is?
I think in addition to, right, when you consolidate media ownership, you're consolidating content and representation. I think it's important to note that there are often these things called must-run segments. So when you have common ownership over a lot of local stations, they might put together a news package that, you have to run that day as a part of what you're airing. Sinclair Broadcasting is really famous for this. They're one of the major companies that is trying to consolidate even more right now. And they typically would put together these super ultra conservative rhetoric packages that their stations would have to run. And so if you think about if the ownership cap is lifted or eliminated and these companies are able to buy up as much market share as they want, they can control as many local stations as they want, we would run into the situation where a mass audience is now essentially getting the same news segments, right? And it's not necessarily, it's not just that it's, not local, it's that it might not align with them. It might not speak to them. It might be harmful to the community, right? If we're thinking about this really radical rhetoric that doesn't reflect how the majority of Americans feel. And, I think I take issue with this because, I think something you said, Feliciano, really resonated with me. It's not just that we're force feeding content to people that they didn't ask for, right? It's also that at some point we have to ask ourselves, is this a propaganda machine? What impact is this going to have on what we collectively decide is the truth? And so when people look to local news and rely on local news for the truth, then, that's an important piece of our democracy. If we start to allow, mass distribution of lies, of mis and disinformation, of harmful information, stereotypes, false things, at what point can we rebuild that trust as communities and say, this is what we hold together as a shared truth?
That's a really good segue into, this conversation also does touch base on free speech. And if you could both talk about, where the line is on infrastructure regulation and, licenses, as opposed to what is actually happening in terms of free expression and free speech and the authority and of who can enforce this or who allows this and who should draw on that authority.
I can jump in. I mean, this should really go without saying, but I mean, it's the topic at hand, and I think we can't hit it enough right now. The FCC's role is to regulate communications markets in public interest, not to shape free speech or speech period, not to favor any political agenda or determine which voices are acceptable. A healthy democracy depends on the existence of an independent media free from government influence and political retaliation. This just feels so cookie cutter. I can't believe I have to say it, but it's so important that we're saying this now. Journalists This is also that journalists can hold power accountable regardless of who's in office. And what you've seen under Chairman Carr's FCC's actions, they should raise serious concern that agency has drifted from its foundational role and towards advancing President Trump's efforts to reshape the media landscape by rewarding companies aligned with his policies while signaling consequences for those that are critical. We've seen it. It's been on national headlines. It was the main topic of the last oversight hearing. When this regulatory body is charged with protecting competition and localism appears to operate in this way, it undermines not only the FCC's independence, but the principles of free expression and democratic accountability that independent media exists to safeguard. This has been my life's work and motivation to get the actual balanced story out there. I come from a community that was often painted in a negative way, regardless of whether there were positive or negative things going on. And that's what drove me to get into media and journalism. And so many journalists, particularly of color, have been motivated by this. And what we're seeing is the erosion of that even ability to do this as a profession. Because what's happening is the avenues, the companies that once made it possible to report on the truth and hold people accountable and hold entities accountable are eroding quickly under this current FCC. And it's darn right scary. I think people should be very concerned with Chairman Carr's refusal to clarify whether the FCC has authority to lift that 39% cap during the last hearing or not. And I think it should deeply concern anyone who values free speech and local media representation within our democracy.
At risk of sounding like a fangirl, I'm going to quote Commissioner Gomez again. But she said something at the hearing last week that really stuck with me. She was recounting about how when the Radio Commission was created, which is essentially what became the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, Congress considered making it a subdepartment of the Department of Commerce. But Congress changed their mind because they felt like it was too dangerous to give one power, or the Secretary of Commerce, the ability to regulate all communications. And so they understood even then, right, that even when they were just dealing with radio and telegraphs, that the line between regulating communications infrastructure versus speech or content is really thin. And navigating that thin line, it's not a perfect science, but it has to be done intentionally and with honor for the Constitution. So if you're asking me, which I guess you are, I don't think that, the FCC has the power to regulate content or speech. And that's where we get into something that's not democracy, right? That's where we start choosing which side gets to control the media, the content, the positioning. And I think that's why there was such, public outrage at what's happening with Chairman Carr and his behavior to, try and strong arm media companies into doing the president's bidding, in addition to abusing his investigation powers, to try and police content. But I feel like all of that is so far removed from how we've proudly operated and protected freedom of speech, freedom of the press in this country for the last 250 years.
Thank you both. It's, both, sometimes it can feel overwhelming, but I really appreciate you both kind of bringing context and history, legality, and this journalistic background to to this conversation. We do have some questions in the chat. So I know Ronald noted that in the past, our community has had to do their own news when it's come to lack of resources. So his grandparents crowdfunded their own news and lectores and their own signs. And we have seen that in communities before. I'm going to push some of your questions together, Ronald, and let me know if that's wrong. But in a structure in which, we only have certain avenues for media right now. How do we reduce dependence on maybe the Spotifys or the Apples or the YouTube while still reaching a long thing? So this is kind of this competition with big tech. And then, is there a better structure for alternative franchise models or chapters or shared newsrooms? Is there a way that we can go about strengthening local news instead of this consolidation of power?
I'll take a stab at the first part. Right now, we are smack in the middle of that development. I think a lot of you may have noticed a lot of the journalists, prominent broadcast journalists of color, have been let go. Right, and I don't think it's by accident. Within the last year, within the last term, there have been journalists that have been critical of the administration, and they had their following and were popular, but were still let go by major media outlets. And what you've seen them do is go independent. So a lot are on Substack. A lot are promoting on social, and they're supporting one another. It's, for example, I think it was a colleague told me that Don Lemon spoke with JudeAnne Reed about how to get her channel going, and just sort of how to, because he had already had so many followers, just kind of gave her some advice. I can't confirm that. This is what a colleague told me inside the industry, but it makes sense. And so I think the strategy is to sort of band together and kind of find unified voices. There are plenty of journalists of underrepresented communities that are structurally trying to help each other. But the fact remains that, even if you are able to get a strong following on social, that's still not any sort of substitute for having, access to 80% of the broadcast markets across the country. So those are kinds of apples and oranges here as far as this merger and this particular issue goes. But I think the short answer is unifying and supporting and amplifying one another's voices in this particular critical time in media and journalism. And I don't think you should ever turn your eye on getting word out via social or via digital outlets or new media. I think you have to embrace that and continue to press ahead.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I think also, I think two pieces. First, right, when we're looking at who owns broadcast licenses, there are a couple of barriers. And the largest one is access to capital to be able to purchase those broadcast licenses. And so that's a related, but not quite squarely within this conversation, right, piece of how do we increase diversity in ownership of media. And so like a good example I would say would be Latino Media Network, which is a new media company that was started by one of, someone that's worked in the policy field for this for a long time. And she's Latina. And so being able to, establish a company like that, I think is really important and shifts the power, to something that's closer to our community in the least. I think the other piece of it is on this decentralization part that you were mentioning, Ronald. I think, there's a advocacy organization named Media Justice, and they have an affiliate network, and they have a number of community resourced journalists, news organizations that I highly recommend taking a look at. I think that's where the shift is going right now, is like, how do we make something community owned so that it can't so easily be taken away from us? And thinking about the decentralization in the terms of funding, I think is the biggest barrier. And so whether it's crowdsourcing or looking into, something else, I'm certainly not an expert on how to fund a news organization at the community level, but just some things to check out.
Thank you both. I think you guys make some good points, and that this is also, a larger conversation that's happening in other spaces. It's not about taking away community-driven, conversations on social media. It's about that there's something to be said with the resources and the accountability and the training that comes with, these vetted journalists who do this for a living, and the amplification of that voice across, media in ways of either, streaming or, we're talking about streaming or movie theaters. We're talking about all of these things are very connected in how communities receive media, how communities connect with people, and the opportunities of ownership, the opportunities to be a journalist on a national level, the opportunities to even act or be in media, or any of these things that are given when it comes from something like being a broadcast journalist, like being on your local news station and moving up, or getting those opportunities like Feliciano talked about that are historically, we're gate kept from us for such a long time. So it's not about just saying, no, no one's here saying like, don't create a Substack or don't create your own local kind of community here around some of these items. But there is amazing resources and moving up in the world and kind of generational building on when we get to be part of these systems that have historically left us out and that we should be part of because we are the fifth largest GDP, because we're, human and we deserve all this. And just because, it's perfect for society as a whole. It benefits everybody. We're talking about this from the Latino perspective or the bilingual perspective, but we know that the local journalism and access to these things benefit everybody in an emergency, in an election season, and even just feeling connected to your neighbors. So there were a couple of other extra questions here that we have a few more minutes, and then I'm going to ask one more question, Ron, and then we have to kind of wrap it up here. But if public media funding shrinks, what functions must decentralized media replace first? Local reporting, cultural programming, emergency info, investigative journalism, and why? I don't know, Feliciano, as a producer, if you have like a kind of important thing. We hope that we don't have to get to this point of picking and choosing, but kind of what functions do you think are most important to start off with?
I mean, for me as a journalist head, like just, news reporting, period. Before, unfortunately, it sickens me. My kids watch Sesame Street, but like, I think it's important that you have publicly funded critical news reporting and trying to make sense of events in the world, particularly when you see pretty clear bias amongst supposedly or previously independent agencies. You need someone telling the masses about what's going on. I I don't know. I mean, breaking down the priority there, it hurts. All of those things hurt. I mean, obviously, any emergency alerts, that's key. That's probably number one, and then second, news. But you don't want to. It's looking like it's coming down to that, but you don't want to have to prioritize, and that's why it's important to get the word out amongst your networks, and also if and when you can, try to support public media as best you can, whether it's you or folks with deep pockets, put the seed out there.
I think that's a good point and a good it's really hard to replace the resources and infrastructure that broadcast stations have because they can do the emergency alerts and the news and the community building. Like that's part of their importance as opposed to having to pick and choose with cutting that away. I'm going to let's take the next 5 minutes here and just wrap up with some really clear call to actions from both Daiquiri and Feliciano. What are actions that communities can take ahead of the next February 10th? I know there's another FCC or congressional Senate hearing. There's a lot going on. What are some next steps and then that we can take soon to ensure local news, public safety, and representation remain central to media policy decisions?
I mean, it's critical right now to make sure that anyone concerned here is make sure that members of Congress understand the real consequences of these decisions in their own districts. Lawmakers need to hear directly from journalists, community leaders, and constituents that local news is not expendable, and that consolidation at this scale affects public safety, civic trust, and democratic participation. This isn't about politics, it's about accountability. Members of Congress, particularly those with oversight responsibilities, need to know that people are paying attention and that the law matters. When constituents make clear that allowing mergers that push beyond the 39% ownership cap has real community impact, lawmakers will be far more likely to step in and demand meaningful oversight. Silence just enables decisions like this. Engagement creates accountability. So get out, reach out to your members of Congress and let them know that this is a critical issue. We're at a crossroads.
I echo that, call your reps, email them, let them know that you oppose this merger and why. I think sometimes is a question of how much does that matter, but each office does have to record all of those messages that they're getting from constituents every single day. And so, do it and do it often. I think also support your local news station and journalists, tune in, engage with their accounts. Every little bit helps.
Amazing. And where can we follow you both online to keep the conversation going? I know you both are working on some fantastic upcoming programming. So, and you guys post amazing takes and insightful takes. And if we want to keep following you guys, where can we find you?
I'm on social at Feliciano_news. That's FELICIANO_news. And on LinkedIn, just under my name, Feliciano Garcia. And if you want to check out my op-ed titled Broadcast News Cuts Hurts Communities Nationwide, you can find it at dcjournal.com. dcjournal.com. It's worth a read, and it has some good information that you can use on this issue if you're interested. And thank you for your time. This was great, everybody.
And I am at DACICE, DAQICE. ICE is my middle name. And that's on Instagram and TikTok, where I do, kind of short videos, takes on things like this. And then again, my name on LinkedIn, I'll probably be the only DACer that pops up.
Thank you guys both. I too am on LinkedIn. Not many JudeAnne Heaths out there either. We are on Instagram at http_policy. Please feel free to visit all of our websites. Come to us. We continue to work on policy, not only when it comes to media and communities, connected broadband, AI, workforce development. And these are all intersecting issues for our community. So please stay involved. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you again to Feliciano and Daiquiri for their insight. And everyone have a wonderful week. Stay safe out there, and we're better together. And so continue to stay involved with all of us. Thank you.